risk adjusted backlog. So risk adjusted backlog is a sprint or a release backlog contain risk response task for the actionable risk. And if we if we see there are negative risks, there are project threat that are like anti-value, and if the risk occur, it take time and resource away from effort that deliver value and threaten the project benefit. So therefore we should not only plan to deliver high value feature early, we should also plan to execute the risk avoidance and risk mitigation activity early too. So for a risk management may seem to be like a traditional project driven management effort that would not work well in the agile environment. However, agile method are risk reduction vehicle and are actually very well suited for rapidly identifying and reducing the risk. So let's try to explore risk management in more detail, starting with the definition of the risk. So if we go with the PMBOK guide and we see at the project management guide that already that generally exists, it says that a risk is an event or circumstances that could transpire and impact the project. So most risk literature focuses on the event that have potential to negative impact or the threaten to the project. But also PMBOK says that a good risks are also the opportunity for the project. For the negative risks, these actions include avoiding the mitigating and the transferring of the risk. But for the positive risk, they include the exploiting, enhancing, and the sharing of the risk. So that is the reason if the risk is positive, they can also consider as an opportunity. But if the risk is negative, you can consider it as avoid mitigating or transfer um, to the maybe to the next iteration, to the next phase of the project. So if we look at the this risk management process, we are going to discuss few part of the, not in very detail, but this is how a risk management process is look like. So start with the know plan, estimation, and management. Then you identify the risk, you perform some qualitative analysis and quantitative analysis, you plan risk response and monitor and control the risk. So one step that appear to be absent from this process is the risk response doing, and in which the action identified in the risk response plan are completed. So this step is not actually missing. Instead, these activities are scheduled with the project's regular work activity. So the apparent lack of doing step does mirror the problem seen in the many projects. However, namely the risk management is undertaken as a separate, sometime one time only, a passive activity that does not derive enough action on the project to prevent the risk from happening. So as a result, we see risk occurring and can point to where they were identified on the risk list. And yet not enough was done to prevent them. So the iterative nature of the agile project helped to overcome this issue, and through iteration we can tackle high risk areas of the project sooner rather than the later. So this approach get problems out in the open while there is still room in the schedule and budget to work on them. So it also reduces the amount of effort that we are going to invest in work that they end up being scrapped. So the important point here is that we in agile have an opportunity to do the risk response doing along with the risk response identification. And because agile projects are both business value and the uh, uh, risk driven, and this means that we choose practical bundles of work based on the assigned business priority, and what high risk item remain in the prioritized features list as the story backlog. So if we have stories with the residual risk, we would want to move to the risky item up in the queue and undertake them as appropriate. But before, let's try to understand first that what are the first important factor that also question comes before we go for this to understanding the risk management process, that why we need a risk adjusted backlog, right? So the risk because what is the need of risk adjustment backlog? And if you look at it at a little granular level, so the risk adjusted backlog is a sprint or release backlog that contain risk response task for the actionable risk. So the for negative risk that we have said, we've seen that these actions include avoiding, mitigating, and transferring. And for the positive risks, they include exploiting, enhancing, and sharing. So for the both category of the risk, it is also possible to accept risk that do not have a better solution. Acceptance can be either at active or passive. Or active acceptance of risk means that creating a risk contingency reserve in terms of time, cost, and scope, and using this reserve to deal with the risk as they occur. So the passive acceptance means that nothing about the risk at the time and dealing with them it they have if they have realized. So risk involved with the feature is an important factor in the prioritization of the product backlog, and the product backlog is continually reviewed and adjusted. One. Second thing is that the customer, along with an analyst or other team member, prunes the backlog. So while pruning, impact risk analysis is a key item broken down analysis for their interdependencies, shift up and down in the priority, re-estimate, remove, and relocate the iteration or the releases. And this happen mostly weekly on the agile team. And analysis the impact of change requirements should be routine more successful with the agile team. So if you look at, if you want to have a look at how the risk adjusted backlog has been created, we'll come back to this slide again. If we go here, so what happened is that, so if you have a backlog in which you have, say, suppose feature 1 and then feature 2, feature 3, feature 4, and so on. So this is generally normal list look like, but if you go in any agile uh, backlog, you will find that it list look like this. So feature, there might be one risk response that has been used in the project, and then might be again feature 2, then feature 3, there might one more risk response that has been adjusted here. We will see that how this item comes into picture in between, because when you plan, you don't plan by keeping this risk response into consideration. You plan by these features, and when you plan by these features, how come this risk comes into picture? But if you see at an overall backlog, that what I'm explaining, if we look at whole as a backlog, which means that risks are adjusted and these adjusted risks are taken as a backlog user story, so that the response turn into doing of the response rather than just identification of the response. So if we go back to our risk management process, so the first step that comes is the um, risk identification. And risk identification can happen at the following stages, right? So one is the uh, team discuss a risk handled successfully, the chances of reoccurrence of the risk, and what will be done differently for risk mitigation in the subsequent iteration of the sprint. So in case of sprint, so this is the first thing that we are going to read here, that is the risk identification. And if we come to this point in the process of identification, what is going to happen is that the one point that where the risk identification can happen is we find the risk identification opportunities, right? So what happened is that team deliberately sit down and discuss that what all risks that can happen progressively when they are planning for the sprint iteration or maybe release. So if these risks are identified here, they get a list of those lists, and because these risks are uh, very much visible to them. Second, maybe you can go to the retrospective meeting at the end of each iteration. You can have retrospect on the iteration or on the release, where you can successfully mitigate or evade an activity that are highlighted and shared with the stakeholder too. You can have one option as sprint review meeting, right? In the review meeting, when you are having a discussion with the stakeholder, you're having a discussion with the PO and with the team itself, you have an opportunity to identify the risk. You have an opportunity to discuss that the risks that are already been identified, they have been either mitigated or transferred, or maybe some other action has been taken on the risk. The next comes is the um, on the Scrum meeting, right? So you might identify, assess, and respond to a risk. So team work with the product manager to maximize the output and thereby reducing the risk of the failure. You can have an opportunity in the maybe iteration planning, that is sprint planning meeting, right? So when you are planning, you might have an feeling or gut feeling, or maybe you can see a visible say suppose the technology is changed and you know that the technology is changed and the previous technology is not going to be no longer be supported by the service provider. So you can see a visible result, and you can plan this in a sprint planning meeting, that this risk they can foresee, the team can foresee, and now they need to create a story, or they need to somehow respond to this technical glitch that has been happened in between, which were not planned in the previous sprint. So next is the we can say the requirement gathering meeting, maybe another meeting that generally happen between other stakeholder and maybe product owner, where product owner can see that something is happening already in the market, which may hamper the delivery of the team in terms of value. So the product owner may want to scrap this particular feature. Instead of that, they want to come up with a new feature. So that things can be identified in the requirement gathering meeting as well. So if such risks are being identified there, they can be taken down to a level of the team, and they should be discussed with the team and then plan the future iteration as well. One opportunity I also observe is the if you have having multiple team and you are having a scrum meeting, then no, most of the risks are also being identified in this meeting as well, in terms of dependencies. So if such dependencies exist within the project and all the team members are aware of these dependencies, then they might be discussed in the scrum meeting, and uh, and uh, and they can then maybe cascade to the teams, and each of the scrum representative in the scrum meeting go back to the scrum team, and identified risk may be shared with the team, so that a appropriate action can be taken. So these are the few things, few area of opportunities where the risk identification can be done. And once risks are identified, we will go to the second step. So the second step is you can perform a you can do a risk assessment that comes on the perform the qualitative analysis or the quantitative analysis. So the risk assessment uh, the is the risk assessment is the process of acknowledging the broad risk categories can be that can be helpful to define the broad category of the risk that can be assessed on the basis in the previous step where we have identified the risk. We can divide them in the broad category, and so you can have multiple areas where the risk assessment can be happen. So maybe there are maybe political risks. What you're doing is the assessment of the risk, right? So the political risk, maybe there are environmental risk, there may be few social risk, right? There may be risk that are acting out of technology. You may have um, risk based on the legal standpoint. You may have economic risk. So if you want to remember it, the acronym comes with ESTLC. The best spelling. So P for political risk, E for environmental risk, social risk, technology risk. You have legal standpoint risk, and you have economic risk. So these are the assessment of the risk that can be divided into the broad category, and you can then divide this risk in the broad category, and you can see that which risk fall under which category, so that appropriate action to the appropriate department can be taken, or maybe if it can be handled at a team level, then you have the opportunity to identify the risk assessment. And you can also have an opportunity as an agile practitioner or agile project management, that you can use few techniques to have the assessment of the risk, and one of them is risk sensors, right? So risk and census is a simple framework for analyzing the risk exposure of a project. So for each risk, a probability and the impact out of the risk is determined. And the impact can be either in terms of time or cost, or both, right? So here the delay in the project process time due to risk is counted in terms of days. So the risk exposure is then calculated by multiplying the probability and impact that the overall risk is then tackled as as assessed as the risk of a project. So it's a simple formula which we are seeing in the subsequent slides, but the risk census say that expected monetary value of the risk is equal to risk impact into the risk probability. Right? So we will discuss in the previous next slide that how we calculate this formula, but you can say that the risk impact and the risk probability, which will give a quantification analysis assessment of the risk. So the next is the risk board. So risk board is an information radiator that is used to make the risk on a project transparent to the team and the stakeholder. So by using risk board, the identified risks are displayed along with the probabilities and the impact. So this board should be reviewed by the agile team members and the project manager on the stand-up meeting on the daily basis. So one is risk sensors, another is risk board, right? So this risk board have a normal list of the features, and you can also define two things. What is the description of the risk? What is the risk impact, and what is the risk probability. So this board is being displayed in the Scrum area where team is generally have stand up meeting, and these risks should be identified, and impact and probability should be seen on the daily stand up meeting, because that will give us a visibility that we are responding to the risk that has been identified. Another is the risk burned on chart, and there are a normal chart like burned on chart. You can have risk burned on chart also. So the risk burn-on chart is a simple graphical indicator of the trend present in the risk of the project. So this this chart displays the exposure of the risk and its impact and response. So along with the time progress, the status of the risk factor is updated, and letting the agile team members know that how much is achieved and how much is yet to achieve in controlling the risk. So there are two things. One, there is this risk assessment board is there, and the risk assessment chart on the basis of this board, that how many risks are there, and as the time progress, whether we are mitigating the risk or we are responding in some way or the other to the risk or not, right? So this is the another way of the risk assessment. So now the question is, what is the risk response, right? So that we have seen in the another phase. If you go and see, you have performed a qualitative or a quantitative analysis on the basis of census board, and on the basis of a burn down chart, and then you come to a risk response, right? So when you do a risk response, there are four things that are generally should be done in order to understand the risk response. So one is avoid, right? If I divide it into four ways, so this avoid, mitigate, transfer, and accept. So what I do when I work with the team, I display even this chart in the Scrum area, or in the place where the daily stand-up meeting is happening, and I want team to paste sticky in this area to see that what is happening with the risk. Right. So when we say the risk is being avoided, it means that if a particular story is risky, the avoid strategy should be used to remove the story from the backlog. So this is however not possible in all the cases, and it depend on the importance of the story in the project. So when we are saying avoid, we are saying just remove this story from the backlog, and we avoided this particular risk. So for example, um, if you want to take an example, if if let's suppose in a project, if we have, say, suppose four method of third party vendors. One is maybe use of Paytm, one maybe use of Razorpay, one maybe a use of PayPal, and maybe use of UPI. So if these are the methods and we see that there is some risk in implementing the API of the Ethereum, because that are not very successful as of now, so we can avoid this story and we can live with almost three methods of Razorpay, PayPal, and the UPI method in order to for the payment gateway, right? So if so in this way, if we avoid this user story will be either modified, or we can remove a particular story of the third party integration with the Paytm. So this is the one way of avoiding the risk. There are multiple ways. If you see that the story's importance is little low, but can be removed low and can be removed, then you should avoid that risk. The second is the mitigate. And when we say mitigate strategy, agile team tries to reduce either the impact or the probability of the risk or the both. So suppose a team is aware about their velocity, then they can predict the amount of work that can be done in an iteration. So this mitigate the risk of overcommitting and undercommitting during the iteration planning meeting, right? So if user is velocity is 60 and they cannot want to take, they don't want to take a risk by overcommitting, so they say that we should not take more than 62 and minimum they should be taking 58 story point. So in that case they are mitigating the risk of getting failed at the end of the commitment, at the end of the sprint, for the commitment they have done to the product owner. The next way is transfer the risk. So using transfer strategy, the risk is transferred to another party. A commonly employed transfer strategy is outsourcing, where you assign work to the third party. However, transferring risk does not completely eliminate the risk, but this is called residual risk because which should also be dealt with. So if you're not taking the risk with your own set of people who are working and you want to outsource this for some time so that another person expertise can be used, so you transfer the risk from your own team to the next team. So we are not saying that next team is not capable enough to do that, but you know that they are expertise in that system, and if your team is going to work on it, it might take risk. But in that manner what you're doing is you are transferring the risk from one way to the another way. So the next come is the accept. So using accept strategy in consciously accepting the risk and with the risk as it arrives. So the strategy is usually used for the risks that have either a low probability and the low impact. So we accept that this risk might exist, and we want to live up with the risk with taking into the consideration the repercussion that is going to happen with this risk. Say suppose one of your team member is going for marriage and that was not planned when we started the project, and that might delay the project for around 5 days. So that we have accepted this risk that there is a delay in the project for 5 days, so you should have that visibility that this project is going to delay for 5 days, or maybe other team member can pitch in and that delay might come down to 2 days. So what you did is actually you accepted this risk, you have mitigated this risk in a sense that you have accepted the risk, not mitigated the risk. You accepted the risk that this is going to happen. If you mitigate the risk, other team member will pitch in and say that the 5 days delay will not happen and we will stretch for say suppose a few more hours, and we would be in a position to compensate it. So these are the risk sorry so these are the risk responses that can be used to mitigate the risk. And the last one is the risk review, monitoring and control, and is the name of the forum or the meeting where the risk of the project are reviewed again and again. And during the review, the probability and the impact of the risk is reassessed for the better, and also new risks if arising are identified. And the daily stand-up meeting, planning meeting, Scrum or Scrum meeting, too can serve as a platform for risk review in the agile project management. Right. So these are the ways by which we can uh, we can identify the risk, we can assess the risk, we can plan a response, and then we can review the risk by monitoring and controlling the risk. So this is the peculiar risk management process that is generally being used in the industry. So if you go further and try to understand a little more about handling the risk in terms of expected monitoring value that we have discussed, we are going to take an example to discuss the risk impact in the dollars, and what is the probability and the percentage. So once most of the team are comfortable with the ranking requirements, story, feature, and user case by business value of level of risk. So this process is often subjective and based on the customer or the proxy users gut feeling or the preferences. So if we want to get more scientific about it, However, we can focus on the return on investment per feature. So this calculation starts with the understanding of the ROI of the project as a whole. For example, before approving a 2 million project, a company presumably does a cost benefit analysis to determine whether the revenue or the saving to be gained from the project justify the cost of the undertaking, and calculate its return on investment on the project. For example, say suppose the project is of $2 million, but the risk on investment, the return on the investment is, say suppose $4 million in 3 days. So for regulatory compliance and maintenance costs, we can still come up with the dollar figure, the dollar amount to be related to the economic penalties of the non-compliance, right? So, so once we have the ROI of figure of the project, the business representative, specifically not the development team, is involved at this level, but the business representative should distribute or prorate this amount across the identified features. And business representative often push back at this idea with a comment like, I can't put a dollar value on the sales report, what would be too subjective or misleading. And it can be helpful to remind them that someone come up with a projected payback for this project. So if that figure cannot be divided across the product features, then where did it come from in the first place? So what it's saying is that what you need to do is you need to divide the overall project cost. Say suppose we say that the project cost is $2 million, then the feature list that exists in the backlog, you should define these $2 million costs in terms of features. So if you can divide this $2 million cost in terms of feature, then 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 you are very clear with the fact that what value which feature is going to get you, and then on the basis of that value you can take a decision that whether this feature is valuable to the team or to the customer or not, based on this dollar value that it's going to give. So, so after the business representative have attributed dollar value to the product feature, we will have a prioritized feature list with the ROI value. So maybe you can say that this is going to take $5,000. This maybe $4,000. This maybe $3,000. This may be $2,000. This may be $1,000. So now you have a list of the feature along with the dollar estimation of the value that you think you are going to deliver. So now once you have that this dollar value, you need to find some way to monetize all the risk avoidance and the risk mitigation requirement. To get this figure, we can calculate the expected monetary value of the risk. So for the purpose of simple calculation, let's assume that using a simple housing reporting tool has no cost to the project, but buying a high performance reporting engine will have cost $10,000. So there is a 50% chance that will end up in needing a high performance tool. So with that data, you can use the following formula that we have seen here as that is expected monetary value. So what is the risk impact in dollars and what is the risk probability in terms of uh, risk percentage? So $10,000 you require a high tech machine, and say suppose the risk probability is 50%. So what is happening is this cost comes to be around $5,000, right? So now what happens is that now you have a risk that is having a cost of $5,000. You can adjust this risk somewhere here, right? Similarly, you can, whenever the risk comes to you, you can define the risk probability and you can define the risk impact. On the basis of that, you will define the EVM, that is expected monetarily value, and on the basis of that, whatever the figure comes, you go and adjust this figure on the risk backlog, and this what is called risk adjusted backlog, because you have taken a monetary value of each and every item, and then you are taking the monetary value of this that is going to incur. And when you are comparing these two value, you have a risk adjusted backlog um, um, in place. So the EMV, that is the expected monetary value, or expected value monetary in terms of monetary value. Technical risks usually have an associated purchase cost or penalty, and that can be translated into the dollar amount. And human resource and the business risk are likewise be estimated in the monetary term. And we tend to think that we cannot assign a monetary value to a certain thing, but always remember that insurance company have all the ways to find the monetary value of a finger, find the monetary value of the emotional distress of the client. So even you can also do the same thing, and you can also ultimately find the the overall you know value of the risk. And then once you define the value of the risk, you are in a position to adjust it in the backlog. So once you have this thing in place, and you can see the expected backlog, you can see that now you have one more backlog of the risk that is there, which is saying that risk number one is worth, say, suppose $4,000, and risk two is worth $5,000, risk three is worth $2,000, and similarly, risk 10 is 100 or $1,000 worth. So of course, all the risks have avoidance or mitigation step that we can schedule into the project. So some risk may have to be accepted or transfer, or maybe avoid. But for the risks that are proactively tackled, however, the response action can be prioritized along with the functional feature. So when we combine, we get a risk adjusted backlog. So similarly, for this backlog that is there and the risk adjusted backlog, you adjust this backlog into this primary backlog, and then you have a risk adjusted backlog with you. So this is how